Welcome to the Wanderers History Podcast and to a new episode looking at the history of some of the most important Doges in 16th century Venetian history, part of the wider Rulers and Monarchs of the 16th century Mediterranean and Europe series. In the previous episodes, I've talked about Doges Leonardo Loredan, Andrea Gritti, Girolamo Priuli, and how Venice navigated the very turbulent waters manifested through the War of the Leagues of Cambrai, Cognac, but also the Ottoman-Venetian Wars. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you to please hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. It really does help the channel a lot, so thank you in advance for that. Now, let us resume. In the previous episode, we ended it in 1567 and the end of the Dogeship of Girolamo Priuli. His rule, while largely peaceful, it tried at all costs to not get involved in any conflict against the Ottomans, notably at Gerba in 1560 and at Malta in 1565. Born in the beginnings of the 1480s in Venice, he was part of the very influential Loredan family, Pietro that is. Naturally, many important roles came up his way, being senator, member of the Council of Ten, and elector of previous doges. He was also podesta or governor of Adria. He himself was elected in 1567 on November 29th at the age of 85. He was at the time described as being quite advanced in age but also prosperous, as written of him by Papal Nuncio Giovanni Antonio Facchinetti, who would later become Pope Innocent IX. This was, however, the usual case with Venetian elected officials in what was effectively a gerontocracy, an oligarchical system where the eldest of said society were in power and controlling much of the policies of and wealth of the state, republic, or empire. Popes and Venetian doges used to often reach ages of 80 in a time when, during the early modern period in general, reaching 50 was quite an achievement. Pietro Loredan had a few problems to deal with in his dogeship. The growing discontent in Cyprus was one of them, something his predecessor also had to deal with. The new Ottoman Sultan was much more of a mercurial figure than his predecessor, as Selim II was eager to make his mark with an inaugural conquest. Loredan became preoccupied by the shifting power dynamics at the Porte, something we've discussed before when we talked about the conquest of Cyprus in the first episodes of the podcast. Mehmed Sokolu Pasha and Joseph Nasi, or Mikas, a financier and close associate of Selim II, struggled for defining the route taken by Sultan Selim II. Mehmed Sokolu Pasha wanted to avoid war against the Venetians, keep the peace, while Nasi, who also became the Duke of Naxos, had vested economic and political interests in Cyprus, which he wanted to become part of the Ottoman Empire. We have a letter sent by Venetian bailo Marcantonio Barbaro in 1568 to Doge Loredan saying, quote, "In this connection, I should mention that although Michiel is so hated by the Pasha that he has often tried to reduce him to ruin in various ways, the other has always managed to save himself, the Grand Signor himself excusing him and defending him on several occasions. Many persons thinking the reason for this is that he very frequently pleases the Grand Signor and various of the principal agas of his court with trivial presents of comestibles. As a result of these gifts, the latter takes every occasion to be of service to him with the Grand Signor. Is this thus that he is able to maintain himself in spite of Mehmet Pasha, who is his mortal enemy?" End of quote. This was quoted in Cecil Ruff's excellent book called The House of Nasi, which discusses at length the history and fascinating personality of Joseph Nasi. Pietro Loredan could not do what his predecessor had done, that being the postponement of what seemed to be an inevitable conflict over a maladministrated Cypriot kingdom filled with rancorous discontent, maybe apart from a more Latinized Famagusta. Loredan and Venice either had to give Cyprus voluntarily to Selim II under his conditions because of Cyprus's former links with the Mamluk Sultanate, conquered by the Ottomans in 1517 by Selim I. But this would have caused a dangerous precedent and made Venice seem weak with her commonwealth. It would also have sent a bad message to the inhabitants of Venice's other parts of the commonwealth, such as Candia or Crete. The other option was to join once more a coalition or holy league with the papacy and Spain, but historical precedent did not favor Venice given what happened during the Third Ottoman-Venetian War and events at Preveza in 1538. Unable to reach a compromise with the Porte and the Ottomans, Venice saw no option but to join the aforementioned Holy League and hope for a united victory against the Ottomans. This was highlighted in the reply of Venice's ambassador in Spain, who stated, quote, that the forces of His Catholic Majesty should be united with ours in order to oppose the fury and power of the Turks, to which we have readily assented because of our desire for the universal good, and because we hope that the Lord God has turned his compassionate eyes towards Christendom, and that he is willing at this time to repress the audacity of the infidels. End of quote. The Venetians found themselves in a very difficult position once more. They needed the help of Spain and Philip II. Venetian diplomats sort of had to stroke the ego of Philip II, who in a way continued the conflict in the Mediterranean that his father, Charles V, had against the Ottomans and Suleiman. There would be also this incentive from both the papacy and Venice to form this Holy League, to have it better organized in a cohesive effort. However, as tensions were ramping up in the Mediterranean and the situation was getting quite complicated in Cyprus, things also got quite complicated at home as well. In 1569, on the 13th of September, there was a great fire at the Venetian arsenal, rumored to have been caused by Ottoman agents. Venetian finances were greatly strained on the eve of the War of Cyprus, and according to Kenneth Seton in his Papacy and the Levant, Volume 4, Proveditors were asked in 1569 to reduce expenses and thus decrease the number of mercenary soldiers in Dalmatia, Crete, and ultimately Cyprus. In retrospect, this was a poor decision, as we saw Ottoman raids in Dalmatia all throughout the early 1570s, so 1570 up until 1572, but also the state of planifications in Cyprus of fortifications, but the amount of cavalry and active soldiers that they had garrisoned there was precarious. This financial shortage was a reason for which Venice in 1569 appeared more disposed to joining the papacy, hoping for some ecclesiastical concessions that the papacies of both Pius IV and V had granted to Philip II of Spain. While the war was briefly postponed mainly by events which occurred in Yemen in 1569, which the Ottomans had to resolve, by January 1570, Mehmed Sokollu Pasha could realize that he could not prevent a new war emerging against the Venetians. Venetian ships were seized in Constantinople, merchants were arrested, and small skirmishes were launched against the Dalmatian possessions of the Republic, most notably in the failed siege of Dulcigno. Sokollu tried to mend things in the 11th hour, but with the commencement of the siege of Nicosia in 1570, he realized that the damage had already been done, and at the time a compromise was unreachable. Pietro Loredan, in the meantime, he died on the 3rd of May 1570, when tensions were rising to the breaking point. The War of Cyprus started, and on July 3rd, 1570, Ottoman troops landed near Salines in northern Cyprus. Alvise Mocenigo succeeded Pietro Loredan, a Venetian Doge who couldn't avoid what had become the unavoidable. In the next episode, we'll talk more about Alvise Mocenigo and his important role in 16th century Venetian history. Thank you for listening to this quite short but important episode of the Wonders History podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already to never miss any new history material from the podcast. And until the next time, all the best.